1968. 1968. What a year. If you look back through the history books, they will tell you it's one of the most tumultuous times in American history outside of the Civil War. Today's times, we may look at 2019, 2020, 2021, and possibly 2022 as tough times. We may look at the years 1984, 1976, 1972, 1941 as tough times. A lot going on. 1968 was an interesting time. I myself was a little too young to fully understand all of 1968 as I was born in 1965. But the history books is full of events from 1968. And sometimes it doesn't hurt to just reflect back on the year 1968. What we'll do here now is look at a few of the highlighted stories of the year of 1968 and reflect back upon those times. North Korea seizes USS Pueblo, January 23rd, 1968. On January 23rd, 1968, the USS Pueblo, an intelligence gathering ship of the U.S. Navy's operating in international waters, was deliberately attacked, boarded, and subsequently taken as a prize by units of the North Korean Navy. Pueblo was outside the internationally recognized limit of 12 miles from the Korean coastline, but the North Koreans claimed a 50-mile limit, thereby justifying their seizure of the American ship. No U.S. Navy vessel had surrendered to an enemy at sea since the War of 1812. One American sailor was killed in the attack. The ship was taken into port and crew imprisoned. During the attack, the Americans had little time to destroy the raft of classified data and encryption equipment aboard the vessel, largely because there was so much of it abroad. The U.S. Navy lacked the naval assets in the area necessary to launch a rescue mission during the attack. Before the week was out, the presence of the Pueblo in the harbor surrounded by North Korean naval vessels was confirmed. America's reaction was immediate. Congressman L. Mendo Rivers, a South Carolina Democrat, insisted that President Johnson issue an ultimatum demanding the return of the vessel and the crew under pain of nuclear attack. Other leaders were more circumspect. The crew and their commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Lloyd Bucher, were imprisoned by the North Koreans in prisoners' worlds of camp left over from the Korean War. They were routinely tortured, physically and mentally. Commander Bucher was told that he was to be executed as a spy and stood up before a mock firing squad. Crew members were repeatedly beaten by the guards. When the North Koreans staged photographs of crew members to demonstrate they were being well treated, many of the sailors posed while giving the middle finger to their captors. The North Koreans were told that the gestures were a Hawaiian good luck symbol. When they learned the truth from an American publication, the beatings became more savage. Negotiations between the North Koreans and the United States for the release of the crew dragged on throughout the year. Commander Bucher, faced with the threat of watching his crew being executed before his eyes, signed a confession that the ship had been in Korean waters operating as a spy ship, apologizing for his actions, although he managed to leave enough clues in the confession to allow American analysts to determine that it had been coerced. The negotiations were further complicated by the South Koreans, who were concerned that American actions could lead to a renewed conflict of the peninsula. The crew was finally released in December after spending nearly all of 1968 in custody. The North Koreans refused to release the ship. It remains today a museum vessel in Pyongyang, still a commissioned warship in the United States Navy. The Pueblo affair divided the American public, some of which demanded immediate punitive military actions, while others, concerned over the quagmire of American involvement in Vietnam, held a more restrained response. American military prestige suffered a severe blow, and the amount of classified information lost to the North Koreans and their Soviet sponsors was devastating. Although the Pueblo affair dominated the national news in early January, it was quickly relegated to the back pages by the conflict in Vietnam, which by the end of January dealt America another shocking blow. The Tet Offensive, Vietnam, January 30th, 1968. In January 1968, the United States launched what became a controversial aerial bombing campaign against North Vietnamese forces in the region of Tay Son, where the U.S. forces maintained that the combat base there. The U.S. Air Force would eventually drop over 100,000 tons of bombs on enemy positions in support of the KSCB, and the base would remain under continuing attack through March. Daily news reports on the evening news during those days of just three major television networks showed the severity of the fighting and mounting casualties. American leadership, both military and politically, repeatedly informed the public that the U.S. was winning. The American public was informed that the North Vietnamese ability to fight the war was being systematically degraded and victory was in sight. In the night hours of January 30th, North Vietnamese regulars and Viet Cong guerrillas launched a series of coordinated attacks in cities and towns across the length of South Vietnam against U.S. forces and Republic of Vietnam forces and Allied troops. More than 100 South Vietnamese towns, villages, and cities were attacked, many, if not most of them, successfully due to the level of surprise achieved. The attacks were the beginning of an offensive which was the largest military operation of the war to that point. The preceding month, General William Westmoreland, American commander in Vietnam, had emphatically denied the ability of the communists to launch a major assault, telling Time magazine that he hoped they would try it because we're looking for a fight. Despite the initial success of the North Vietnamese regulars and Viet Cong, the Tet Offensive, named after the Vietnamese New Year's, became in many areas a protracted and bloody campaign. The city of Hue was mostly overrun by communist troops, to be slowly retaken by U.S. Marines troops over the course of February at a cost of more than 4,000 casualties, more than 600 of them killed in action. The withdrawing communist troops executed 2,500 civilians. Total civilians casualties in the Battle of Hue were well over 5,000. In Saigon, communist troops, which had been living in the city undercover prior to the attack, emerged to join the North Vietnamese regular battalions attacking targets within and around the city. The communist troops were eventually defeated, but the shock value of their attack and the number of attacks that were launched simultaneously eroded the confidence of the Vietnamese people to resist, as well as the confidence of the American public in the veracity of their leaders on the scene and in Washington. By mid-February, the Tet Offense had been largely defeated, other than mop-up operations which went on through September. The casualties inflicted on North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were heavy. So were the casualties on the Americans and its allies. The Tet Offensive, though a military defeat for the North Vietnamese, was a public relations victory as more and more Americans began to strongly resist involvement in Southeast Asia, with protests and demonstrations against the war growing in size and intensity as the year went on. The Martin Luther King assassination, riots, April 1968. On April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King was shot as he stood on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee. The riots, which exploded in cities across the United States, represented the largest incident of civic violence to occur in the United States since the Civil War. Riots in cities, large and small, saw acts of vengeance, personal violence, looting, theft, and vandalism. White businesses were frequently targeted by individual acts of black-on-white violence, were less frequent than during the widespread urban violence of the preceding summer. Over 100 cities reported acts of urban unrest. New York, Boston were largely spared due to the quick and decisive action of civic leadership. Washington, D.C. was not spared on the night of King's assassination. Protesters led by Stokely Carmichael on the march, demanding that businesses close on the 14th Street corridor out of respect to the slain leader. Some businesses complied, but in a short time they were being broken in and looted, as they were those which did not comply. By noon of the following day, confrontations between rioters and police were taking place in several locations throughout the city. More than 13,000 federal troops were deployed, setting up defense perimeters in the steps of the U.S. Capitol and the White House lawn. Before the Washington riots were brought under control, more than 900 buildings had been burned, and damage remained visible in the city for decades. Nearby Baltimore didn't feel the violence until April 6, when rioters and National Guard troops faced each other in several of the city's neighborhoods. Martial law was declared in Baltimore, and Maryland Governor Spiro Agnew was pointedly critical of local black leaders for not doing enough to protect their city. Agnew's comments drew a favorable response from Republican presidential candidate Richard Nixon. In Cincinnati, rioters took on a definitive black-on-white character when they erupted on April 8th. More than 1,500 National Guardsmen were required to placate the city, leading to hundreds of arrests and to at least 2 deaths. The riots, which broke out nationwide, were divisively political. President Johnson urged local civic leaders to preemptively request the support of the National Guard or federal troops rather than waiting for an event to transpire before asking for aid. Johnson told Chicago Mayor Richard Daley that he would rather move them and not need them than need them and not have them, in reference to dispatching troops to support local law enforcement. Several cities found the response to the King assassination to be an excuse for the continuation of unrest triggered by other issues. Many conservatives condemned the riots as a repeat of the urban unrest of the preceding year, particularly in Detroit. The Republican Party used the urban unrest to reinforce its position of supporting law and order in opposition to the growing number of civil rights protests and anti-war demonstrations across the country. Republican candidates for national for national offices, including the presidential election later in the year, positioned themselves as candidates who would ensure compliance with national policy and law and respect for the institution of government, including the military draft and civil rights laws as written. Columbia University student protests, April 1968. Protests against Columbia University in the spring of 1968 were a two-pronged expression of university policies on the Vietnam War and racial issues. Columbia was a major property owner in New York's Harlem neighborhood, with many residents of the area paying rent for their residence to the university. Over the preceding decade, more than 7,000 residents had been evicted by Columbia campus expansion, more than 80% of them black or Hispanic. The Students for Democratic Society and the Student Afro Society were separate student groups which at first worked together in the protests, later separating along racial lines when the SAS decided to stress its own position, which was anti-segregation over that of the SDS, predominantly concerned with Columbia's support of the Vietnam War. The diverse nature of the protests led to poor communication between the two student groups, both of which clashed with Columbia Police and NYPD over the issue of construction on the Morningside Gym, an alleged segregated facility being built on Columbia property. Both the SDS and the SAS occupied several university buildings and offices, which the SAS stressing the racial issues which impacted the students at Columbia. By the end of April, the NYPD has dislodged the protesters from the occupied buildings. The main goal of the SDS was for Columbia to discontinue its relationship with the Institute for Defense Analysis, a government-funded think tank supporting American intervention in Vietnam. Thus, the two protests, which ran simultaneously, were presented to the world as being racially motivated in one case and anti-war in the other. The students' occupation of various buildings and offices was seen as a disruption of the educational institution and American efforts to win the war. The presence of outside activists not affiliated with either student group or the university, one such as Jane Fonda and her husband Tom Hayden, negatively affected public opinion. The Columbia protests were particularly divisive nationally, as they were seen as being conducted by privileged students, many of whom were from wealthy families who enjoyed draft deferment by virtue of being enrolled in college. The image of Columbia University suffered from the negative response of much of the public, with enrollment and endowment suffering a decline from which the school did not recover from for more than 2 decades. Columbia severed its relationship with the IDA in the aftermath of the protests, and both ROTC and CIA recruiting on campus came to an end. Naval ROTC would not return to Columbia until 2013. Columbia also took steps to improve its relationship with the Black and Hispanic community of Harlem, largely ending the expansion of its campuses onto properties it owned there and shifting its expansion focus to the west. The protests of April and May became more fodder for the law and order candidates, depicting the students as shields of uh, radicals against the government's legal application of the law. The Catonsville Nine, May 1968. As As American involvement in Vietnam increased throughout the 1960s, anti-draft demonstrations and protests grew in cities and other college campuses. An underground railroad for draft evaders was established, with safe houses and other havens identified in Canada. Protesters burned draft cards and urged others not to register for the draft, as was required by law. Inequities in the application of the draft law, including the perceived inequities over deferments, were a major source of conflict. Protesters against the draft were not merely those of draft age. Many were from other groups, protesting the draft as a means of protesting the war. Philip Derringer was a former Justified priest and opponent of the Vietnam War, who, along with an artist named Tom Lewis and two others, occupied the draft board in Baltimore in October of 1967, pouring chicken blood purchased from a nearby market on draft records. He was out on bail for this offense when he, Lewis, and seven others occupied the Selective Service Board office in Catonsville, Maryland in May of 1968. All of the nine were Catholics. One, Thomas Melville, was a former priest, and another, Barringer's brother Daniel, was a Jesuit priest. The Catonsville Nine, as they called themselves, removed 378 records from the office and burned them. Tried in October of 1968, they were convicted of the destruction of government records and sentenced to 18 years, after which four of the arsonists, including the Barringer brothers, went underground rather than show up to serve their sentences. They would surface from time to time, especially Daniel Barringer, to issue pronouncements or otherwise support anti-war activities. Barringer, the Catonsville Nine, were a polarizing group in several different areas. Catholics and conservatives decried their activities and their continuing evasion of authorities. Draft opponents supported their actions, while supporters of the Vietnam War and the government in general called for harsh penalties. The Nine were the inspiration for numerous anti-draft protests in which protesters took similar actions, often fleeing the site of the protest to avoid arrest. The burning of a draft card, which is an official government document, which is a federal crime. The Catonsville Nine and many copycat groups that inspired further division in the American people during the summer of 1968, along the lines of support of the war in Vietnam and support of American institutions. By the end of the summer, conservatives were of the opinion that any protest against government actions was unpatriotic and providing aid to the enemy and encouraging the otherwise defeat of North Vietnamese to keep fighting since Americans were polluted with enemies within. The first Catholic priest to ever occupy a position in the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list came from the Catonsville Nine group. The assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, June 1968. At the end of March 1968, President Lyndon Johnson announced without fanfare or previous hint that he would not be a candidate for re-election as President of the United States in 1968. Johnson had barely survived a primary challenge from Senator Eugene McCarthy, and the emerging candidacy of Robert Kennedy was a challenge which he no longer welcomed. Johnson had also come to the conclusion privately that the war in Vietnam was not winnable, and whoever was the next American president would be the first to preside over an American military defeat. Robert Kennedy offered the advantage of youth, which appealed to the increasing active younger voters in America. The legacy of his slain brother Jack, not yet stained by knowledge of his numerous extramarital affairs, and a large campaign chest. Although he had a late start, he gained momentum rapidly, aided by his calming speech delivered ad-libbed in Indianapolis on the night of Martin Luther King's death, and the steady deteriorating situation in Vietnam. After winning the California primary, Kennedy was shot. As he transitioned the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel, dying the next morning. The shock was profound. Besides the fact of the murder coming once again to the Kennedy family, there was a developing belief that the American political and electoral system was being manipulated by the elimination of candidates through political assassination. To many people, Kennedy's assassination was the latest in a series of murders committed by unknown entities intent on controlling who the American people could choose as their president. The fact that his assassin happened to appear to be of Arab descent, he was actually Palestinian, helped feed this belief that Kennedy was an anti-war, anti-draft, pro-civil rights candidate, also threw suspicions on the far right, the law and order claimants who believed any dissent to be un-American. With Kennedy dead and Lyndon Johnson out of the race, the Democratic Party was without a leading charismatic candidate for the nation's highest office. The possibility of a link between Kennedy's murder and that of Martin Luther King 2 months earlier was immediately the target of speculation. The assassination of Robert Kennedy and its aftermath at the Democratic National Convention revealed a nation in which fear was becoming a dominant factor. Fear of civil rights, of defeat in Vietnam, of an increase in lawlessness, and of the arising influence of the Arab world on America's oil supply displaced what little optimism over the nation's future remained. Chicago Riots and the Democratic National Convention, August 1968. When the Republican Party held their nominating convention in Miami the first week of August, the Republican nominee for president, Richard Nixon, included in his acceptance speech the statement that the nation, with the greatest tradition of the rule of law, is plagued by unprecedented racial violence, and that the President of the United States cannot travel abroad or to any major city at home. He made clear that his administration would stand in support of law and order, the police, and other legal authorities. Later that month, the Democratic Party gathered in Chicago to nominate a candidate to oppose Nixon. They selected Hubert Humphrey, the sitting vice president. Chicago Mayor Richard Daley was determined to make the convention an opportunity to show the world how well the city was run, establishing a heavy police presence outside the convention center and strong party security inside. Daley was intent in presenting party unity inside the hall and efficient law and order outside. He perceived two organizations as threats to his goal outside the hall: the newly formed Youth International Party, known as the Yippies, and the National Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam. Both groups planned to coincide with the convention. About 10,000 members of the two groups gathered in Chicago, despite Daley's repeated pronouncements that there will be no such gatherings to take over the streets, our city, or convention. Daley had 23,000 Chicago police, Cook County Sheriff deputies, and National Guardsmen waiting for the demonstrators. On August 28th, demonstrators gathered in Grant Park were confronted by the police in full view of television cameras. Hubert Humphrey was taking a shower in his hotel room at the Hilton when he was affected by the tear gas. So great was the amount used by the police. The confrontation was called a police riot by many observers, and the police activity was condemned inside the convention from the speakers, such as Senator Abraham Ribicoff, who referred to the police behavior as Gestapo tactics. Daley responded with an anti-Semitic obscenity uttered on national television. Although the riot was initiated by the police and similar tactics occurred inside the convention on the floor, most of the nation was by the end of August 1968 thoroughly tired of seeing protests, and despite clear evidence of police use of excessive force, the majority of polls taken after the fact placed the blame for the riots on the protesters. A group of 8 leaders of the Youth International Party were arrested and charged with conspiracy and inciting to riot. This group became known as the Chicago 8. Eventually, 5 were convicted of incitement to riot, 9 for conspiracy, and all of the convictions were overturned on appeal. The Walker Report, issued by a select team assigned to investigate the riot, placed the blame for the violence squarely on the police and National Guard, stating the police actions were unrestrained and indiscriminate police violence on many occasions, particularly at night. The violence was made all more shocking by the fact that it was often inflicted upon persons who had broken no law, disobeyed no orders, or made no threats. The aftermath of the Chicago Democratic Convention revealed even more clearly defined lines dividing the American populace over the direction of the nation and the application of its laws. The Summer Olympics, Mexico City, October 1968. In the 1960s, the Olympic Games did not enjoy the television coverage which they do in the 21st century, with network coverage limited and usually shown in a news magazine format well after the event. The Olympic Games did not receive the same amount of attention as in more recent years either, but in 1968 they were welcomed as a respite from the events of the year and the upcoming U.S. presidential election, which was at the time considered to be too close to call. The Olympics was regarded as apolitical, an event for the celebration of the sport. American track runners Tommy Smith and John Carlos competed in the 200-meter sprint race, with Smith winning the gold medal and Carlos the bronze. At the awards ceremony following the race, as both runners turned to face the American flag as the U.S. national anthem was played, they bowed their heads and raised black glove clenched fists over their heads, retaining that posture until the anthem was finished. The Olympics was immediately a political event as the image of the two Americans united in a salute which symbolized black power was transmitted around the world. Later it was revealed that the clenched fists weren't the only symbols of protest present at the time. They were merely the most visible. Carlos wore a chain of beads around his neck in memory of the lynching victims, as well as black victims of unsolved murders at the hands of whites. Both athletes removed their shoes for the ceremony, wearing only black socks to acknowledge black poverty in the United States. Carlos forgot his black gloves, borrowing Smith's left-hand glove, which explains why he has a left hand raised in the photo, which would soon be being published in newspapers all around the world. As they left the podium and stadium, they were heavily booed by the crowd. The International Olympic Committee and its president, Avery Brundage, ordered the two athletes be suspended and banned from the Olympic Village for making an inappropriate political statement. When the U.S. team hesitated, Brundage threatened to suspend the entire American Olympic team. The U.S. team then expelled Carlos and Smith from the Games. Brundage had been present at the Berlin Olympics in 1936 and had offered no objection to the proliferation of Nazi salutes during the Olympics, a fact which was pointed out by the few writers who came to the defense of Smith and Carlos, who found little sympathy for their actions when they returned home. Both runners were treated as pariahs by the sports community and most journalists. Time magazine condemned their actions and the appearance it presented of America to the rest of the world. The third man on the podium on that day of the protest was a white athlete named Peter Norman, an Australian who was sympathetic to the Americans and ostracized in Australia as a result. He was not selected for the following Australian Olympic team despite qualifying for it more than a dozen times. The actions of Carlos and Smith was indicative to the rest of the world of the divisiveness within the United States, as well as how that division could have an adverse impact on the rest of the world. Apollo 8 and the Christmas orbit of the moon, December 1968. In December of 1968, still in pursuit of John F. Kennedy's goal of sending an American to the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the end of the decade, the United States launched the Apollo 8 mission. For the first time, human beings left Earth's orbit and traveled to another heavenly body, in a mission during which they would orbit the moon, sending back pictures of their journey by making no attempts at landing. Apollo 8 reached the moon during the Christmas holiday, which brought to a close one of the most difficult years of American existence. During the Apollo 8 mission, which reached the moon on Christmas Eve, the three American astronauts, Jim Lovell, Frank Borman, and William Adner, a broadcast television presentation on Christmas Eve. They read the first 10 verses of the Bible book of Genesis against the dramatic backdrop of the earth as viewed from the moon. At the close of the year, which has seen political murders, extensive urban violence, and a seemingly unending and fruitless war, racial violence, and economic troubles, it was the first opportunity for humans to see the earth rise again against the lunar sky, an event shared with the world. The returning astronauts were selected to be the Time magazine's Men of the Year. The mission was widely lauded as the single most important event of 1968, clearly showing the Earth as a fragile vehicle in an impressively greater universe. Frank Borman reported receiving a telegram which thanked him for saving 1968. NASA rated itself for the historic lunar landing to come in just a few short months. The United States clearly established that it was, despite its internal and international difficulties, the technology leader of the world. But as 1968 goes, it was not without controversy. As was little else in this incredible, troublesome year, the question of investing so much money and efforts in what was little more than, to the critics, than an entertainment and propaganda exercise that was raised. Some in Congress debated whether the money could be better spent elsewhere. There were calls for the incoming Nixon administration to curtail the space program. Geopolitical pundits wondered if the United States intended to claim the moon in the manner of Columbus landing in the New World. The potential of militarization of space and orbiting bodies was fearfully raised even before Apollo 8 returned home. It was an appropriate end for 1968, which was clearly one of the most divisive and decisive years in all of American history. A nation at odds with itself when the year began, found it ending with even greater distrust of its institutions, principles, and people. When considering issues which polarize the nation today, America would do well to consider that troubling year 5 decades ago, or shall we say 6 decades ago now, when the nation threatened to pull itself apart. The year 1968.